Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Rise Africa 2022.
How do people begin to define points of engagement in the city? And in this particular grouping with the migrants within the city? Tariq, over to you.
I think with regards to migrants in the city, a nationalization often brings with it conflicts within nations between who belongs and who doesn't, and who is an other. And where I'm speaking to you from in South Africa, we have a huge problem since South Africa became a democratic nation, with othering within the borders of South Africa, what we locally refer to as xenophobia. And it's such a complex problem that is produced by so many different factors. The most underlying factors are the socioeconomic stress that many people live with, and the daily struggles thereof. And another layer on top of that is government is often very weak or ineffective within those places of desperate need, particularly informal settlements. And very often these things spark off into violence. So in the same ways that we need to understand these issues in complex interacting ways, because that is how they are produced, we also need very clear strategies to try to address them. There have been many responses from civil society, which have been fantastic responses, humanitarian responses, trying to use culture to integrate citizens and migrants, dialogues that have happened, sports that have happened, really fantastic initiatives. Or one great initiative was by an NGO that actually formed a soccer team that won or came in the top position in virtually every league, and they were only blocked to go into the Premier League in South Africa, the South African Football Association, because their whole team was made up of migrants, and they wouldn't change their policy on that. But the point is, there have been such fantastic humanitarian initiatives from civil society, and it needs a collaborative effort from government, where all the political will and political muscle and resources is, because they cannot engage with the phenomenon on the political level, which is how it is mobilized through political mobilization, the violence. So we really need to find, and something that was stressed yesterday as well as part of our idea of creativity. Creativity also means finding those collaborative models where civil society and different sectors, including the public sector and government, can work together to address these kinds of issues. So the problem is produced in complex, coalescing, intersecting ways, and we have to have very clear strategies to address that as well. And public space is part of that. How we build understanding them in co-constitutive ways. So we do many things at the same time with the limited resources that we have.
On the right to the city, and my question is, how can inclusive human settlements through achieving the right to access to housing realize social justice in African cities?
Housing shortage is a key issue in virtually all the major cities of the continent, which are urbanizing, and they're all going to be faced and are already facing housing shortages. Within the South African context, the main model we have is housing mega projects, huge projects that are usually built on the periphery of cities. By and large, that is where they have been built over the last decades, and they come with many challenges because they're far away from economic opportunities, there are long travel distances, there are all the expenses that come with living so far away and not living in a livable environment where there are social resources, cultural resources, economic opportunities, etc. So that model has it does not work very efficiently, and we all know this already. So we are struggling to come up with new solutions and strategies. Now, the way people build housing themselves in informal settlements or generally known as slums, people find spaces within the city, especially migrants, because those are the first places they go to. Those are the low-income places, the places where you don't have to spend a fortune for rental. They migrate, and those become arrival cities, those informal settlements on the peripheries of cities generally. And we have not yet learned how people are, what we can learn from so-called informal processes, how we can develop other kinds of housing solutions that are not necessarily top-down, that do not use the big corporations and construction materials, but trying to understand local systems and working with those informal processes. That is something we haven't yet really found a way to do that. And so we haven't really been able to meet the multiple challenges that we face. And human settlements is not just about producing a shelter for people, it's about producing a living environment with all of its complexities, social, cultural, economic, familial, you know. And so the issue of migrancy, of xenophobia, of xenophobic violence is also part of creating human settlements, because in South Africa, we don't even, the citizens don't really know how to live with one another because of our long, centuries-old colonial history, which we share with other parts of the continent, and our apartheid history, which is also shared with settler societies in other parts of the continent. Apartheid is not so much a unique South African phenomenon. In the early parts of the 20th century, apartheid was almost, some scholars have said, almost a continent-wide African phenomenon in urban spaces. So human settlements is also about this. How do citizens even live with one another? How do we create social cohesion among citizens? And then the migrants issue is even another layer. How do we live with people that have come from other parts of the country, internal migrants or external migrants from beyond the border? So there are so many challenges, and we are still, we haven't yet even developed on scale the strategies to deal with them. But those are some of the issues that human settlements have to address, that it's not just about shelter, but it is about where you locate those settlements, where you build them. Does it provide economic opportunities? How does it facilitate and help people to live together, both among citizens and also amongst migrants? And is it close to economic opportunities where people can actually have a dignified life? Because and I'll end just with this point. One of the three of the most fundamental things that we need to live in a humane way is you need family, you need food, and you need safety. All human beings need these things. And we are struggling to even fulfill those basic dimensions of dignity and respect that we need to have in the city. And human settlements, the way we understand them and how we build strategies, has to accommodate all of those things and not work against them.
This session really showcases many moving parts that need to be considered throughout any and every design process. How can implementing this very nuanced aspect and universal design elements be included more easily into everyday design processes?
How do we bring these approaches to the ground? How do we make it part of the everyday? How does it become part of our culture? The rule rather than the exception, because many of these things, even where great work is done, it tends to be more of an exception than the norm. I just want to make 3 points about that. How do we try to make this more systemic, make it more of a cultural practice? I think that the first thing is, as Prof. Joy and others have already said, and Albus made this point as well, how important a multi-stakeholder consultation is, and having the techniques and the tools and the skills and the soft approaches and soft tools and to be able to do all of that. That is one thing which needs to be normalized, which isn't normalized. The second thing is what the session, the corresponding session yesterday spoke about with creativity. And one of the points, and I think it was Olumide who made the point there, was she used the word in-betweeners. And she saw herself as an NPO, as an in-betweener. So there is an increasing identification that the civil, the private, the public sector, and also how the public sector does its own operations, the internal workings of government, are very siloed and cut off from one another. And there isn't integrated approaches to things. So you are starting to see increasingly people identifying that there is a space between different arms of society and arms of the state that aren't working together. And this is what Olumide called in-betweeners. Even the organization of this conference, the African City for Centers, our future cities, these are agencies and organizations that are trying to place themselves between things, to link things together which are siloed from one another, because they're identifying that problem in the operations, the workings of the city government, and how the different sectors of society work together. So that's the second thing. The first thing is the techniques, the multi-stakeholder engagements, the skills required to do that, which must become normalized in our projects. The second thing are these in-betweeners who are actually identifying this chasm that is existing between things that should actually be more integrated. The third thing, I think, is about how we, the political structure that balances and integrates these things. So, as I mentioned in my beginning opening, from civil society, you see lots of humanitarian initiatives, but it actually cannot operate on a scale which it needs to, in an overarching organized political framework, which only the state can do, only the government can do. So the government has to, on the one hand, both ensure people's rights and balance different things, so different things do not overstep one another and exploit one another, but it also needs to play that integrating function. You know, so there are many, and I'll just end off with a few very practical points. There are lots of projects, and I'm here based in Johannesburg, that are really excellent in some ways. A project here, a project there. So we have an informal settlement on the northern periphery of Johannesburg, which is called Diepsloot, which is a project that is currently live, where there is stakeholders with stakeholder engagement with local NGOs in the informal settlement, with girls in sort of high school age, and these are also high migrancy environments, you know, and trying to understand how we can create safety for girls of these age. But this is an exception, but it's the right kind of thing that's happening, but it's unfortunately an exception. We also have something in the southern periphery of Johannesburg, which is also a live project, an informal settlement there, very impoverished area, also high migrancy rates, where they are trying to understand how to create food security. So things can, in public spaces and with schools and with places of worship, and bringing in other experts, agricultural economists, to understand things in a multifaceted kind of a way. So you can deal with migrancy rights, you can deal with food insecurity, you have it's so complex to bring these things together, and they're little blips here and there of excellent initiatives. There are other parks in Johannesburg. Albus spoke very eloquently to all the problems we have in our parks, and everything he said is spot on, you know, but there are some exemplary parks, and it's a very well-known international project, N Street North Park, which worked with school kids. There's another park in Jeppe which did the same. N Street North also working with migrants in that area. These kinds of initiatives have to become the norm rather than the exception. How do we make it a culture? How do we make it something that is systemic, that doesn't just require require urban champions, individuals to drive these initiatives. So just to sum up again, there was the overarching idea of vernacularization and how we ground these things and how we make these everyday concepts, which, as we have seen in the opening address, is actually a historical legacy of a human rights culture that emerges in one particular part of the world, and we have to learn how to make it everyday and vernacularize into our indigenous cultures. We have to learn the techniques to do that, the skills to do that. We have to have organizations that start to link up siloed sectors of government and society, and then we have to have government that can be held accountable, as Christiana said, but that also plays that balancing role, that guards people's rights, and that can bring different projects together in integrated ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tariq. Thank you.